Buddhism in Korea. Um, and so it's just a look to start out with different dimensions of the sacred. And as I look at these, the ones that I would like to focus on today are especially the material and artistic. That our starting point today will be art, visual art, sculptures. We haven't really used that as a starting point yet. So that's what we'll do today. And also the experiential and emotional, in the sense that today, more so than any other uh, class and topic that we've covered in this class so far, I will talk more about my own experience. So it'll be somewhat autobiographical. I have spoken a little bit about my studies in Buddhism, my Korean background, some of those things, but today we'll go much more into that. Um, so starting out with the material and artistic, starting out with um, images, sculptures of the Buddha that here are a collection of uh, statues, sculptures of the Buddha that I saw at the National Museum of Korea in Seoul when I was visiting in 2018. And one thing about these particular Buddha images are that they are all of Vairochana Buddha. Now, the reading, I don't know if it mentioned the Vairochana Buddha. If so, probably in a very small reference. But you'll see that the Vairochana Buddha is something that is very significant to what our readings were about. This is from the late Unified Silla period. Um, uh, ooh, made out of iron. Gosh, that's going to be a heavy thing. I mean, that would be heavy if it was stone as well. But yeah. Um, there's some notes. I'm not going to get into that, but some of that could actually be quite interesting. But anyway, there is another Vairochana Buddha. Now, the one thing that is highly distinguishable about the Vairochana Buddha is that um, this was helpful to see a source that actually described this. The index finger of the left hand is clasped by the right hand. Yep, that's right. And the source that I have says it symbolizes the union of wisdom and predicament. Now I actually don't really understand what that means when it says, I mean, wisdom, but predicament. I don't really know. So, but anyway, that's something that I'll have to do some more learning about. But the Vairochana Buddha. Um, so there are a variety of different kinds of Buddhas. And I could get into some of that later on in this class if we're talking more about Buddhist art. There is one kind of a Buddha that is also very well known in Korean art, is sometimes referred to as the pensive Buddha. The Buddha's hand is kind of up there, resting on its chin. It kind of like an expression that it's thinking. It might be like this or like this. It's thinking, the pensive Buddha. But here are all Vairochana Buddhas. So actually, here's where I kind of get into the background of this is that this goes back to 2011 when I was studying in Berkeley, California, and I took a course on Chinese Buddhist philosophy at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. Right, this is a continuation of my interest in trying to learn as much as I could about Buddhism. And this is the name of the paper that I wrote. Cataphatic shift in Huayen Buddhism in relation to Buddhist visual art. Now, one thing that I'm going to note here is that uh, I actually um, wrote this paper before this was, I made this trip to Korea in 2018. And so that is where I really kind of discovered a lot more about Korean Buddhism. And so this was basically 7 years before that trip. And because this class was Chinese Buddhist philosophy, I was particularly learning whatever I could about Huayan Buddhism. And I, at that time, did not know that Huayan had any relation to Korean Buddhism. So that was really a discovery that came across later. The reason that I was interested in writing about Huayan Buddhism in China, where it originated, is because of this cataphatic shift. Now, cataphatic, that in and of itself gets into another term that I'll talk about in a minute here. Um, all of this is during the Tang Dynasty in China, in starting in the 7th century through the 10th century. And here are a few of the specific patriarchs of Huayan Buddhism. There is the kind of the 5 major patriarchs in Huayan Buddhism. And so here is what we see there. Um, I don't know how many of the students, I did see a few students in the discussion forum mention that they read the article by Imre Hamar. That's great. That to me seems like a challenging advanced reading. So kudos to those who chose to take that up. And the idea of in Huayan Buddhism, the major scripture of Huayan Buddhism is the Avatamsaka Sutra, um, the Flower Adornment Sutra, or sometimes I've seen it translated into English as the Flower Garland Sutra. And ultimately, the Vairochana Buddha is the main kind of Buddha in the Avatamsaka Sutra. Let's see. Now, my understanding of the Vairochana, I know this term. Now, I don't know how well I fully understand it, but the Vairochana Buddha represents a Dharmakaya. That is basically the teaching body. To me, what I see is that a lot of times the Vairochana is contrasted with Shakyamuni Buddha. Now, I haven't really spoken about Shakyamuni Buddha, but um, let's just say that I did mention Siddhartha Gautama, right? This is the name of a person who lived on earth and was a prince and attained enlightenment and became known as the Buddha being the enlightened one or the awakened one, Siddhartha Gautama. Sometimes they refer to this as the historical Buddha, the Buddha that lived in human history on earth. Now, Siddhartha Gautama is also sometimes referred to as Shakyamuni. And my understanding is that that is kind of a name for the family or the tribe that he belongs to. So Siddhartha Gautama, Shakyamuni, and there are images that would say this is a statue of the Shakyamuni Buddha. They're trying to emphasize that this is the historical Buddha. Now, in contrast, the Vairochana, there's been a few places where I've seen, well, there's the Shakyamuni and there's the Vairochana. A lot of times Buddhist temples will have a statue of Shakyamuni Buddha in there. Some temples say, we're different. Instead of having the Shakyamuni Buddha, we have the Vairochana Buddha. Sometimes the way I've seen the Vairochana Buddha presented is that the Vairochana is a cosmic Buddha. Now, I've been hesitant to do this, but I have done it anyway, is sometimes refer to Christian concepts in order to help understand. And I think this one is getting a little bit tricky. And immediately I preface with, I'm sure there's numerous ways of saying, no, that's not a good comparison. But anyway, we'll go ahead with it. In a way, well, the Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, can be equated in a way to Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. There is a historical Jesus. Jesus was a person who lived on earth and is also in Christianity divine, the Son of God. I'm starting to see that the Vairochana is maybe kind of like the Father. Now, one immediate kind of way of saying, no, that is not correct, is that I don't think the Vairochana is a creator like the Father is in Christianity, but maybe just in the sense of being a cosmic entity. The Vairochana is kind of that cosmic Buddha, as opposed to the physical historical Buddha. So that's just something to think about. Now, here is an article that was influential for me, and this was the article that led me to write about Huayen Buddhism in that course I took on Chinese Buddhist philosophy. Robert Gimello, the name of his article is Apophatic and Cataphatic Discourse in Mahayana. Now that caught my attention because of apophatic and cataphatic. Here are some terms in religion we haven't spoken about. And granted, apophatic and cataphatic are terms that have been used in reference to Christianity for some time, probably for centuries, actually. Now, what these terms mean is apophatic is a way of negation. Apophatic is this idea, don't use images is one of the key things. It can be extended to don't use words. Sometimes it's don't use words, don't use images. Sometimes it's, okay, that's fine. You can use words and images, but just realize their limitations. So apophatic is always trying to say, kind of downplay the role of words and images, and to say, just remember that God, the ultimate being, the sacred, all of these things are beyond words, beyond images. So try to move away from that. That's the apophatic. So you can see the cataphatic being the opposite. Cataphatic is use words, use images, these are helpful for people to understand the concepts. And so with the cataphatic, I'm interested in that because of my interest in the visual arts. And uh, the cataphatic, again, if we look in Christian history, we do see this kind of trend in the history of Christian art, beginning with a time when Christians would use symbols. Even in ancient times, in the first few centuries of Christianity, they would use a symbol of a fish. And so this would be a symbol for Christ. Or they would use, it looks like a P and an X, but the P is actually rho, the Greek word rho. That is basically an R. And the X is the Greek letter chi. That is like a K sound. Chi and rho. That would be the first few consonants of Christ. So when you would see they did not want to, the early Christians did not want to make what we now see a lot, paintings of Jesus. That was kind of not really acceptable territory. So they use these kinds of symbols. There was a time where they would then say, well, here is a painting of a shepherd. And then you could say, well, we can kind of see that shepherd as being Christ. Maybe not. But as history went on in Christianity, there were some discussions regarding this, and ultimately Christians concluded it is okay to make images of Jesus and of the saints and of all of this. One of the key events in the Christian history was discussions that concluded Jesus was God in a physical and visible form. And because Jesus was in a visible form, artists can paint images of the visible form of Jesus. Okay, so there you can see in Christianity a shift from suspicion of the use of images, the apophatic, to the cataphatic. So when I saw this article by Robert G. Mello about this apophatic to cataphatic shift in Buddhism, that caught my attention. Something that I could have shown, I think I do have an image of this. I just now realized I forgot to include that in this presentation, but I can describe what this is, which is that in early Buddhist art, something similar in Buddhism, as I was describing in Christianity, the early centuries where there was hesitancy and resistance to depicting images of Jesus. In Buddhism, in early Buddhist art, they were also hesitant and resistant to making images of the Buddha. But one way that they would symbolize the Buddha in visual art, it's like, okay, we're not going to make the statue of the Buddha, but we will make an image of the Buddha's footprint. So I do have actually, I didn't include that in here, but a carving of the Buddha's footprint that I saw in a museum. Maybe I'll bring that up in another class. But so Similarly, in Buddha, there is a shift from the apophatic to the cataphatic. And Gemello talks about Huayen Buddhism being one of the major transition points into the cataphatic. So this really led me to want to know more about Huayan Buddhism and how that might um, uh, lead to that kind of cataphatic uh, and typically a cataphatic shift and then a flourishing of art would typically result from that coming to that kind of mentality. Now, 2011, I wanted to find some images of the Vairochana Buddha because the Vairochana Buddha is the major Buddha of Huayan Buddhism and the Avatamsaka Sutra. Uh, that to me was not really very easy to find images. I basically did a Google image search. Here is one that I found, and this is a very, very large, it's a spring temple Buddha completed in 2008. And this is apparently a Vairochana Buddha, even if it does not appear to have what the other Vairochana Buddhas had, which is the clasping of the finger, of the index finger. But at this time, I felt like, how do I find a good image of something that specific, the Vairochana Buddha? So that is what I found. My search also led me at that time to find a Vairochana Buddha at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York City. And this is downloaded from the internet, from an image search. Now, since I was in New York this past year and visited the Met, I actually was able to see this one in person. So that was interesting to see that. Okay. So Buddhism in Korea goes back to the unified Silla dynasty. The reading I posted the guide to Buddhist temples in Korea, or I guess it was the guide to Korean Buddhism, um, had a different system of spelling. In most cases, I went back to the kind of spelling that I'm familiar with. So you would see the Scylla in that guide reading, and here I've just changed that to how it's more typically presented. So Buddhism is the national religion in the unified Silla dynasty, and some of this is um, the life of Uisong is one of the major figures, and the life of Wan Hyo, two major monks leading in that kind of um, history of Buddhism in Korea. Just to go back then to when this is Uisong and Wan Hyo bring Huayen Buddhism into Korea, but Buddhism was already in Korea back in the 4th century. Okay, so I don't know actually that much of the history of that. Um, and then in 527, Buddhism accepted in the Silla dynasty. Okay, so this would be the basically 3 kingdoms period where the Silla is one of the kingdoms and Buddhism being accepted into that even before the unified Silla dynasty, although our reading said that Buddhism was accepted in the Silla dynasty later than the other 2 kingdoms, the Goryeo and Bakje. Okay, so if we get back here, the life of Uisong, in 661, he traveled to Tang China. That's just to say China during the Tang Dynasty, and studied under Jian, a Huayen patriarch, and Wan Hyo also was traveling with Uisong to China. I think this is probably the travels where Wan Hyo has a certain experience that we can talk about that was mentioned in the reading. Okay, here's a little bit more about Uisong and Wan Hyo. It took me a while to see that, okay, we've already seen some of this. Zen Buddhism, I'm going to use the word Zen being the one that most Americans are familiar with. Zen Buddhism. Now, if it is Zen Buddhism in Korea, sometimes it's called Son, or spelled that way. And then in China, it's spelled as Chan, but it's basically the same. So partly it's just the way that spellings and terms are transliterated from the different languages into English. In this case, Huayen Buddhism in China is referred to as Hua in Korean. So, some of this has been kind of a slow process on my part to kind of gradually come to learn some of these things. Here is a history then of the 5 patriarchs of Huayan, and then right in that middle part, during the 2nd patriarch, Jian, Uisong travels and meets with Jian. The life of Uisong also founded some very, very, very prominent temples in Korea. That is also mentioned in the reading. Hainsa. Sa is temple. So sometimes you might just see it mentioned as Hain Temple or Hain Sa. The Sa is just the Korean meaning that it's a temple. Or Uisong also founded Naksan Temple, in Korean Naksan Sa, Naksan Temple. And so actually I was very fortunate to be able to visit some of these temples when I was in Korea. Now, this is where some of the autobiographical aspect of this to me is that I ended up visiting, this is Naksan. I ended up visiting Naksan and Hain Temple, not really actually knowing that there was a connection with these temples and Huayen Buddhism, the kind of Chinese Buddhism that I had written that paper about 7 years ago. So it was only later, after my trip to Korea, sorting through things, reading about what I had encountered, that I realized, oh, the kind of Buddhism that I somewhat coincidentally encountered in my trip to Korea were related to a paper that I wrote. So that is kind of given me further motivation to kind of focus on this particular aspect of Buddhism. Naksan Temple is on the east coast of Korea, overlooking the, I think most maps call this the Sea of Japan. I have heard that the Koreans will refer to that as the East Sea. Okay, so in this case, it would just happen to be, I was in Korea for 4 weeks. My parents were actually visiting Korea at that time, and I have a younger brother who lives in Korea. In this case, my younger brother said, hey, uh, let's go to the east coast of Korea. It's a beautiful place to hang out. We'll hang out on the beach. And there's this really cool Buddhist monastery and temple nearby. We can check that out. So it was just kind of random that I visited this temple, Naksan, and then later realized, wow, this was the temple that was built and founded by Uisong. Okay, so that's um, so I have quite a few different photos like this that are just such a beautiful, beautiful setting. I was thinking I could really overload my presentation with just all these photos, so I don't want to overload, but this is just one example of this kind of a side temple, kind of a side meditation shrine overlooking the sea. And so just the setting is really incredible. Um, and up at that temple was also this statue of the Buddha of Compassion, Avalokiteshvara, is another very, very prominent kind of Buddha. Um, and on the sides of some of these temples, there will just be panels and panels and panels of paintings of the life of the Buddha. Um, does anyone recognize this scene? I will zoom in and then it will be more clear. Repeat some of that, a little bit of repeat. Yeah, so Wan Hyo and Wei Song are traveling to China. They're staying in a cave. Uh, Wan Hyo cannot see, but he sees, maybe he feels there's water and he drinks it and says, that's very refreshing. And then the next morning he wakes up and sees that like the water was in a skull or something. What he thought was a bowl was a skull, and the water was putrid and filled with maggots. And so apparently this is kind of an enlightenment moment for Wan Hyo, where he says, well, now I think that's disgusting, but actually the night before I thought it was very refreshing. So um, somehow I guess it makes him think that, well, I guess if I just go back to the mentality that I had yesterday, that it was refreshing, um, I can appreciate it. It's a little bit tricky. I think some of the comments in the discussion forum were commenting on this, and I can understand. Yeah, it's a bit of a strange story. Apparently, Wan Hyo at this time decides, oh, hey, I've found enlightenment already. I don't need to go on to China. So here it seems to depict Ui Song continues on to China. Wan Hyo decides, I've gotten enlightenment. I don't need to go to China anymore. I'm just going to stay back. So there was some of that in that image. Okay. Another Buddhist monastery that I visited, a Buddhist temple that I visited in Korea. Again, not actually looking to visit a temple and not really knowing, what the significance of one temple is or the other temple. But in this case, I spent about 3 days visiting a Benedictine monastery in Korea. And while I was there, the monk who was hosting me asked me if I would be interested in visiting a Buddhist temple. So I said, oh, sure, okay. And so he takes me to Hainsa, Hain Temple. And as we were coming closer, I realized, oh, this is a very significant temple because this is where the Tripitaka Koreana is located. So, it became interesting that, wow, somehow I was able to visit this without even knowing that much and knowing the significance of this. This, again, really, if you look at this, it's at the top of a mountain and just a very, very beautiful, beautiful setting. It's like you're in a national park. Um, and so here is a close-up of kind of the main area. You kind of see there's like I don't know, parking is somewhere like maybe not even in this picture, and then you walk all the way up. And about here is where you start to, like, you park here and you're walking up, and there's all this forest and waterfalls. And you come up here. Most of my time looking around was right around here. So that's the close up here. You come in here, you go through some gates, walk up here, and there's all of this. Actually, here is where the Tripitaka Koreana is. I will show a picture. It's a little bit anticlimactic just because, it is considered one of the great treasures of Korean history and Korean Buddhism. But ultimately, it is hundreds, maybe thousands of wooden boards on shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves. So it's not quite like seeing the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right? Sistine Chapel ceiling, wow, look, that's great. Here it's like, okay, it's basically a storage um, building with all of these wooden boards with the text on it. But anyway, I did still feel that, wow, that is really one of the treasures, even though it's not necessarily blowing you away by what you see. So yeah, Hen Temple. Um, and some beautiful kinds of, this is a drum that's part of one of the structures there. Um, some other pictures, uh, underneath the roof are just really beautiful, elaborately painted underside of the roof support and all of that. Um, this is what, when you're walking by the buildings that are storing the Tripitaka Koreana, you can look in here and say, okay, that's the room where there's shelves and shelves and shelves and shelves of wooden boards with the text of the Tripitaka Koreana. The Tripitaka Koreana, it's Chinese characters. Uh, it's kind of maybe like the equivalent of a rule of Saint Benedict. Actually, it is like a uh, text that describes the monastic life. Um, Now it's much, 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 much longer than the rule of Saint Benedict, but yeah, that's what that is about. And so one of the things that kind of really clicked for me was when I was looking back on the photos that I took, and I would take photos um, of the things that I was seeing, and then try to get photos of signs that provided information. And so a sign told me that this Buddha was Vairochana Buddha. This is in the Great Hall of Tranquil Light, and the sign said, most Buddhist temples have a great hall with a statue of Shakyamuni Buddha. Hain is different because Hain has a great hall of tranquil light with a Vairochana Buddha. And I thought, okay, I remember the Vairochana from this paper that I wrote maybe 7 years before on Chinese Buddhist philosophy. So then I kind of made this connection, and the signs that I was seeing at Hain were talking about, the kind of Buddhism at Hain is Huayen, and it is about the Vairochana and all of that. So that really kind of, in this case, you do see, it appears, I didn't really get the best angle, but it might be that the Vairochana Buddha is clasping the index finger. At least the sign that I saw was talking about that. Right here from this angle, it's kind of hard to see that that's the case. The Vairochana Buddha. Some mention of that in the Avatamsaka Sutra. Here's another source that talks some about the Vairochana. Okay. So, is that another connection to Huayen, and this is a connection to Hain, is another major Buddhist monk, Song Chol. Now that is in the 20th century, and he stayed at Hain for 30 years, and he's another character that I've been somewhat interested in. So with that,